1922, has been in the background of many of her early novels. It represents everything we want to believe about English country life, that it's warm, cosy, and reliable.
I thought it was quite a good joke at the beginning, and then it began to seem to me a rather uncomprehending, patronising, metropolitan joke, and I got a bit restive about it, and then it went on too long. And now I think it's over. I don't think anybody's writing them anymore, and I'm not quite sure what they ever meant. I suppose sort of domestic angst around the kitchen table. But you know, that phase is over, so hooray.
I've read virtually all her books, and she just transports you there, you know, and the characters become real people.
Things happening behind walls that you would never possibly imagine are going on, but my goodness, they are.
You know, it always strikes me that, you know, domestic life and relationships, it's in everybody's life, isn't it? It's common to all of us.
I think she really gets into the heart of the average woman with her home life. She talks about real people, really, doing real things.
Her signature books, if you like, the Rector's Wife and The Choir, captured a world that was about to disappear. The world of the English countryside, of the village, of the small town.
I wonder if readers in Birmingham, Wolverhampton, London find in your novels a way of breathing some fresh country air.
It might be. I mean, they're less village orientated than they used to be. They're more provincial. But it could be so. I mean, people are very understandably aspirational. Could be that.
Do they have something in common?
Relationships. That's really all I'm writing about. I don't think there is anything more important than relationships. You can't run a family, you can't run ICI, you can't run a country without the relationships being right. And they're despised often as being too domestic, too ordinary, but they're the only thing we all have to grapple with, and they're vital.
The Rector's Wife, that was the one that broke the barrier, that made you into a best-selling author.
It's a word of mouth book. It was amazing. I mean, it went into the bestseller list at, I don't know, 6 or 7. And then people began to hand it to each other, bless their hearts. And it sort of crept up on that basis. I was writing about the difficulty of being married to someone else's vocation or career.
Were you surprised?
I'm still amazed, still amazed. Somebody said to me the other day, would you believe this if it was happening to someone else? And that sums it up completely.
So what was it that you did differently, that made it different from the earlier historical books, that made it something that people wanted to pass around?
Well, it was the switch from writing historical fiction to contemporary fiction. And then I really think it was the growing relationship with the reader. You know, I have absolutely amazing readers, and a sort of friendship has grown up. It's very difficult to talk about it without sounding rather sort of soppy. But their response to what I write has given me an extraordinary confidence to venture into areas, death or grief, for example, where I mightn't have dared to go before, and to write more sparely. I know now that they know what I'm talking about, so I don't have to tell them anymore. I only have to suggest it.
Death, grief, lesbian relationships. What started you on that one?
I actually came across such a relationship between a couple of women, where one of the women wasn't really gay, I don't think. The other one definitely was, but the woman who wasn't really gay was in a very unsatisfactory relationship, and was, I think, a ripe plum for the picking. And she had little children, and of course the company of women when you have little children is very, very seductive. They're not bored by the endless repetition of somebody of 18 months. There is a terrific sisterhood when your children are little. So there's a sort of bonding with another woman who knows exactly what to do and what you're going through. And that sort of cosy confidence can quietly and beguilingly tiptoe into love and sex with no trouble at all.
You write about the church a lot, the choir, the Rector's Wife. I wonder what draws you to write about that?
Partly growing up in it. I was born in my grandfather's rectory in the Cotswolds, and I spent a lot of my childhood in it. And he was what is now incredibly un-PC. He was a hunting parson. So his gang of groupies was legion, drove my grandmother insane. And that was really where my perception that the church was full of people who bled when pricked exactly as the laity do, that's where that came from. Instead of the church being treated as somebody or something inside a sort of cordon sanitaire emotionally, they were exactly the same people. And their faith often availed them nothing in times of crisis.
And in a village affair, the two lovers don't exactly get the pastoral support that they might need.
No. Well, I think the church, there's a lot of talk, but I think still out, particularly in remote areas, there's a great deal of traditional, intolerant, fairly rigid thinking. I think cities are far more forgiving, but country places cling to what they've always had. It's part of their sort of reticence, and much better for fiction. If there's trouble, it makes more page-turning fiction.
Do you find yourself drawn to the sea of E for comfort?
No, I'm drawn to God, but I'm rather fed up with the Church of England at the moment, I must say. It seems to lack any kind of adventure or real intelligence or glamour. Just look at it.
You want glamour?
Oh, quite. The Church has often had glamour. Yes. Glamour's not to be despised. It gives things a sort of cool edge.
So you don't think of God being sea of E anymore?
Well, I think he's perhaps a little weary of the Church of England at the moment. He's waiting for it to get through its grey shoe period, I think.
What about next of kin? I remember reading a review about that and the word bleak came up. What's your view?
The children always talk about it as the book which is about death, grief and cows. I needed to write that book. My best friend, who had been my tutorial partner at Oxford and was my twin, bar a month, died of cancer 4 years ago, hideously. And I was completely thrown by my reaction to this. I had vowed to behave beautifully after her death. Didn't manage any of it. And was assailed not only by great waves of feeling, but awfully contradictory kinds of feeling. And I expect because my antennae were out, I found an awful lot of people were coming up to me at signings or writing to me and saying, I do wish you'd tackle death, because modern death is not decent. And also people saying to me, the church isn't any use. My friends aren't any use. They want me to get over this grieving and be normal again. So, the bridge fall can resume. And I sort of needed to write that book. I suppose it was a purge in a way. And I chose a small, modern, unsuccessful dairy farm because, rather like choosing the church, farming gets such a bad and blanket press. And all right, the grain barons in East Anglia may not deserve our sympathy, but the hill farmers, small hill farmers, most definitely do.
Do you feel that you have to fight on their behalf?
Well, I had something to do with publicising a helpline for suicidal farmers and got to see a bit of what it's like, and this awful feeling of being tied upon a wheel. You hate the land, but you cannot leave the land. The land maybe belonged to 3 or 4 generations before you, and you're going to be the one who has to give it up and betray your heritage and your ancestors. And you're alone. I mean, better if you have animals, but for arable farmers, there's a terrible solitude. And that arsenal of weapons to do away with themselves, too.
You're often labelled as the person who holds the banner for the rural idyll, but that's not a rural idyll, is it?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, that's like the Laura Ashley tag. Please look at what I write. Don't just look at how I look or how I sound. What I actually think is in these books.
But you've almost been sidelined as middle-aged, middle class, middle market.
That's all right. Plenty of us out there.
Joanna Trollope is accused of ironing her tea towels. And there are times when she writes like that. The worlds in her books are very limited, very small. I mean, in her newest novel about stepchildren, the children start behaving badly and acting out, and they express this by drinking Coke straight from the can. I mean, they're not rolling joints, they're not doing E's, they're not running up to the nearest big city to try a little prostitution. I mean, they're not doing any of the sort of heavy parental nightmare things. They're just behaving slightly badly in a way that would offend a middle-class mother.
I think she's generally regarded as writing about sort of people who are slightly, well-educated, privileged, wealthy, but the concerns that she deals with, age and wealth and privilege have no place in this. I mean, pain is pain, whether you're rich or poor. And that's, I think, she gets further under the skin of everyday problems that we all face.
It really is warts and all, isn't it? It's not, you know, Barbara Cartland happy ever after things. It leaves you with something to think about.
She's incredibly perceptive, very wise, and knows how people tick. Great psychological insights.
Joanna Trollope has been Joanna Trollope. I mean, she writes from her heart. She writes about what she knows, loves and cares about. She does it very gracefully. I think part of the great secret about her is that she hasn't lunged for the market. She hasn't attempted to be commercial. She's just been true to herself.
You don't have a problem letting your life leak into your work.
It's got to. I wouldn't be a novelist otherwise. I'm sure you've asked this rather autobiographical question of masses of novelists. And I'm sorry to say, if any novelist ever said to you, oh no, my life is something quite separate, that is not the truth. I mean, you don't put your life directly into a book because you need to be as skillful as Evelyn Waugh to achieve that, really. And it sort of dies in the process of transference. But everything you have learned and observed and experienced over 4 or 5 decades has to inform and instruct what you write. That's what gives it life.
What can we infer then from the latest book, Other People's Children?
A sort of lifelong preoccupation with the stepmother, which dated, I remember it terribly clearly, from being taken by my grandmother to see Walt Disney's Snow White, and I suppose I was about 8, and had the heebie-jeebies about the Wicked Queen and couldn't sleep alone that night, and my grandmother was very patient. And I remember saying to her, why is the stepmother so horrible? And why doesn't Snow White's father stop her being so horrible? And it just sort of, as an idea, lurked about in my mind. And this is decades before I became a stepmother myself. You know, why does society need this myth of wickedness? Why does being a second wife mean you have to be second best?
But being a stepmother, it's a very difficult role.
Yes, it can be virtually impossible because you are expected to mother yet not to mother children who are a large amount of the time hostile to you. It didn't actually apply to me. I have 2 stepsons who've behaved with amazing generosity. But then almost everybody says that boys are easier than girls in this situation.
Other People's Children, it's a complicated plot to explain, but can you try?
Yes, I'll certainly have a try. It's basically about step-families. You know, these families all coming together, all these disparate children and adults who are not blood relations. And the essence of it, I think, is summed up by the father of one of the 2 heroines. And he says to somebody else, you know, I don't really understand what's going on. He said, you know, all my life, I suppose he's about 70, all my life I've played in this tidy little 3-hander with my wife and myself and my daughter. And now my daughter proposes to marry this man with 2 children by somebody and 1 child by somebody else. And he said, suddenly I find myself in a mad musical with a cast of thousands and a very poor director. That's what it's about.
In this book, it's all pretty horrid.
I know, but you see, the thing is, you're dealing with something very atavistic now in a step family. You're really going down to the most primitive layers of possessiveness and jealousy and belonging and love in not a generous sense at all. Love in I must have. And that, the veneer of our civilization is so thin. You know, we behave beautifully outwardly. We form orderly cues. We do not, on the whole, punch each other up on the underground. We endure the travails of commuting and supermarket shopping. But the beast's there, and the beast isn't very far down. And the beast only has to be seriously challenged, like my beloved daddy marrying someone else, and the beast is out of its cage.
It's expected that Other People's Children will sell more than 500,000 copies. But success wasn't overnight for Joanna Trollope. It took more than 20 years. More of that in part 2. Joanna Trollope has been writing for more than 20 years, but has been famous for only the past 6. Before that, there was financial hardship, heartache, and a painful divorce. But now, she's happily married.
Oh, the rector's wife rescued us. We were absolutely on the verge of bankruptcy. We'd had 3 winters without the heating on. Quite extraordinary. So, I mean, this success dates from the paperback of The Rector's Wife, which was the summer of 1992. So not even 6 years ago.
Right up to the time of your breakthrough, becoming a best-selling writer, you were writing, sometimes with very young children. How did you do it? And what kept you going?
Oh, you know, the original conscientious SWAT in the back row of 3B. I always had homework in on time. I said I'd write a novel by March, so I did. Put the children to bed and wrote it at night. Couldn't possibly do that now, but I'm talking about, you know, me in my 30s.
For 20 years you wrote well-researched historical novels, but they weren't very successful.
No, they really weren't. They really weren't. They were bought by libraries, but not really by people.
Did you believe in them?
I suppose in a rather diffident way I did. I didn't believe in them, I have to say, in the same energetic way I find I can believe in the modern ones.
Okay.
I might have known at some level they were an apprenticeship, which looking back I think they were.
You're doing all this work, but you couldn't afford to keep the heating on.
Well, those novels actually applied to a former period of life and a former marriage.
When that marriage ended, were you changed, affected?
Nothing as big and painful and regrettable as a divorce cannot change somebody. I think it would be indecent if it didn't change you. You know, it's like a grief. You learn to live with it, but you never forget you've done it.
What was happening in your life when you decided to leave history and move to the present?
I just got stuck. The desire to write, the desire to communicate was still there. And I'd just written a big saga historical novel called A Taverner's Place. And it's a perfectly competent book, but it wasn't really very satisfying to write in a funny way. It was as if I wanted to go somewhere else, but I didn't quite know where to go or how to get there. And it was in fact my husband, Ian, who said, do you know, I really think you've got to come out of the historical cupboard and go to Sainsbury's. You've just got to look at modern life. And I immediately said, I can't do without the research. I'll be so exposed, I'll be so vulnerable. And he said, well, choose a subject that you don't know very much about. And that was the choir, not knowing anything really about sacred choral music, and not realizing that the politics of the cathedral close are still so truly Trollopian.
It seems, talking to you, that you don't feel like a genre writer.
No, I don't think I do. I feel like quite a traditional writer. When I'm being Miss Harvey, I'm more of a genre writer.
Oh yes, Caroline Harvey.
Yes, her.
Who is she?
Who is she? Oh, she wears a sort of depressing cardigan. She's an amalgam. Her name is an amalgam of my Trollope grandparents' Christian names.
So this gets us into the area that your great-uncle, 5 generations back, was the famous writer, Anthony Trollope.
Yes, he was, but I'm not a direct descendant, I'm sad to tell you. I come from the same family, but a much more below-the-salt branch.
Okay, all right.
So I'm afraid if any genes did a bit of zigzagging, it were big zigzags.
But in that line, there's a Caroline and there's a Harvey.
Yes, my father's parents.
So do you do things as Caroline Harvey that Joanna Trollope would never even think of doing?
Yes, I do. Because Miss Harvey is definitely in a genre. She writes romantic fiction, and it's what the trade so unattractively calls period romantic fiction. And in romantic fiction, you know, you can have a happy ending, you can have coincidence, you can move into an altogether more operatic, emotional realm. But you can't have irony. You can't tease and send the characters up so much. You can't have quite the same toughness about them. And bleakness would be out of place. So although it's fun to have a gallop off the lead every so often with a Caroline Harvey, it doesn't satisfy me quite as deeply, I have to admit, as being Miss Trollope.
So she's not as proper, really?
Well, she's sort of more proper in a social sense. She's just not quite as real, perhaps, although there is reality in her, I think.
TV. How do you feel about that?
I'm not very pleased with all of it, but it definitely did help. And it did bring new readers. And TV just does. So however writers feel about the adaptations of their novels, it is unquestionably good for the numbers of readers. But what is upsetting is that when the finished version bears no resemblance to the spirit of the novel you wrote.
But it did bring you to this position, didn't it? Joanna Trollope, OBE.
I know. What does one do with an OBE?
I don't know, I haven't got one.
No, lives in my knicker drawer. I think that's where it'll always live.
Do you feel different when you're in your home village?
No, I feel exactly the same as I always have. I've got no overdraft now, but I've got the same friends I've had for 30 years. I like doing the same things. I don't want to live a celeb life. Don't want to go to premieres. Don't want to be on sort of TV shows playing cookery games. I just want to go on as before. Except I've now got, and this is amazingly blessed for somebody in midlife, this extraordinary, enriching career.
You seem to like people who are stoic.
You see, I think that's insufficiently admired. I remember reading a wonderful interview, Benedict Nightingale interviewing David Hare. And I remember David Hare said, look, he said, there are problems in modern life that neither therapy nor socialism can cure, and they have to be borne with stoicism. And I cut it out. They do have to. It's the penalty of free will. We all have that. Perfectly right. We all make our own choices. Perfectly right. But then you've got to carry the can.
If the countryside is full of stoics who aren't complaining, things aren't going to get better, they're going to carry on getting a raw deal, which you obviously think they are.
I do, and I also feel it's dangerous if we don't keep the balance between town and country. We are much more metropolitan than we were even 50 years ago. And it isn't good for cities if that's the case. You need the two poles, you know, you need tragedy and comedy, you need yin and yang, you need all these opposites for the healthy life of any community. And I just would hate to see the countryside as agriculture declines, turning into a sort of sanitized theme park.
It seems the countryside permeates all English art, great landscape painting, great music. Do you feel that even if you never ever go outside a ring road, you somehow need the country to be there?
I do. I do. I think people who would be panic-struck, taken beyond, you know, zone 1 of the underground system, need to know that out there something of the Anglo-Saxon rural idyll is still in place. It's a curious sort of pantheism. I think a lot of the Northern European races have it, but we in England seem to have it particularly acutely.
Now you've become somebody to listen to. If you'd written to the papers 20 years ago complaining about the plight of country folk, people wouldn't have taken notice. They
No.
do now, so you have power. What are you going to do with it?
Go on writing. I mean, everything I've got to say, or almost everything I've got to say, I say best in fictional terms. And I'm not saying anything very new or very dramatic. I'm mostly saying the old values work because they were tried and they were tested, and they come up time after time as the ones that hold society together.